Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. My name's Rebecca. If you're new here, you're very welcome, and if you're a regular, then welcome back. We're in week 45 and it's the first week in November, and that means we're working with a colour prompt this week. If you've been watching over on Instagram, you'll know that our prompt is earth tones, so we're getting really autumnal with our colours, and this week we're also stitching a really autumnal panel as well. I was really pleased with the way this one turned out, and I hope you're going to enjoy it too. We're using our fill stitches from this month's stitch guide video, which I'll link below, and there'll also be a card during the video as well. If you haven't watched that video, do go and check it out because it gives you some really helpful tips to get really good finish in your embroidery. I'm also going to use some stick-on Soluble Stabiliser, and if you've never used that before, don't worry, I will explain it along the way, and I'll also link another video where we go through the process in a lot more detail. I've put a complete list of everything you're going to need in the description below, so do check that out. Gather all your bits and pieces and let's get stitching. Our prompt is earth tones, and obviously that includes lots of brown shades, but we've just done a page of neutrals and I didn't want you to think that we were just going to carry on using browns. I've got a rainbow of threads here, and these are pretty much the pure versions of the colours. When we're referring to earth tones, what we're talking about is these shades but with some brown added in, and so what we're looking for is colours where mixed in with the dye there has been some sort of brown element added. So again, I've got the full rainbow, and I'm hoping that you can see on the camera that these are the same value of colours, so the colours are as strong as each other, but this alternative muted rainbow on the bottom is much more sort of earthy and natural. We're looking for those colours that we can easily find in nature, particularly at this time of the year. They just look like they've lost their zinginess and are fading away, and that is perfect for prompts that fit autumn. So don't feel limited to browns and greys. You can use all the colours of the rainbow, but just try and find versions of the colour that are a little bit toned down and muted. I only actually have one design idea for this week, and this has been a long time coming. Months ago, somebody messaged me and said, please could we do a week where we looked at mushrooms, and because I do tend to work quite seasonally, we keep our prompts appropriate to the time of year. This one I've been waiting on for ages. I'm going to use this lovely sort of reddish cranberry felt, and we're going to create some mushrooms. I'm going to mostly use our fill stitches from the November stitch guide video that I put out earlier in the week. We could do some thread painting on the mushroom stalks, but I thought we could also do a little bit of applique to make the mushroom caps. I thought that was probably too big a space to be satin stitching, and maybe create some grass or a bit of ground for our mushrooms to sit in, just to sort of root them and make it look really organic and natural. I've created this as a pattern and it's available free of charge on our website at the address at the bottom of the screen. So if you don't feel confident drawing your mushrooms, then you can download that and make use of it. I just wanted to take you through some of the preparation that I've done. So I've got a piece of Bondaweb here, and I've traced my mushroom caps onto it. Now, when you use Bondaweb, you need to bear in mind that your images are going to be reversed, because when I put that onto the back of the fabric and peel the backing off, when I turn the fabric over to put it glue side down, my design will be reversed. So what I did was trace the back of my image. I just turned the page in my sketchbook, put a light box underneath it and traced it from behind, but you could flip the image. I've also traced it onto a piece of Soluble Stabiliser. We have used this before. This is basically a medium made out of starch. The rough side is water soluble, and that's where you draw your design. And then when you are ready, you peel away the backing and the starchy side is actually really tacky on the back, and you stick that onto your panel of fabric or felt, and then you've got your outlines to stitch inside. When you finish stitching, you just run it under a cool tap or soak it in cool water, and the starch will dissolve and wash away, and you'll just be left with your stitching. You can trace it or sketch it freehand if you don't have any of this stabiliser. You could trace your design onto fabric and stitch that on. Don't worry, you could just freehand it if you wanted to. So I've roughly cut out my mushroom cap shapes, and I've got some Japanese yarn dye fabrics here because they tend to be really earthy tones. If you've never used Bondaweb before, don't panic. I did a video back in January and I go through this in a lot of detail, so you can click on the card at the top of the screen and it'll take you straight there. I've basically traced my mushroom caps onto my Bondaweb, and I want to place it rough side down onto the fabric. The rough side is the glue. And then you just hold a medium iron on it for about 10 seconds, and that melts the glue and attaches the Bondaweb to your fabric. So now I'm just cutting it out on the lines neatly, and that means I've got glue right up to the edge of my shape. Then I'm making a little tear in the paper so that I can peel off the paper backing. Now, I don't have any outlines on my shape, so I'm just getting my stabiliser with the pattern traced onto it, and I'm just laying my mushroom cap on my pattern, and then if I just hold it loosely, I can slide my stabiliser out of the way, and then my mushroom cap's in the right place. Now I'm going to hold my iron over it again. That'll remelt the glue and attach it to the felt. Now, Bondaweb doesn't really like being attached to felt, so these won't be permanent. They will need some stitching. I'm just going to add the rest in the same way, and then we'll look at the next stage. So now I've got my mushroom caps in place. I'm just going to peel off my stabiliser, and I want to line it up with the mushrooms. So I'm just placing it so that they're lined up at the top. I can sort of feel the fabric through. And then if I fold it back, I can just check as I'm laying it down that the mushroom caps are in the right place, and they are pretty much spot on. So that's me all set up, and now I can start stitching. I've gathered some threads here, and I'm going to start with the gills under the mushroom because I want to put in place some things that are going to define the shape of the mushrooms once I dissolve this stabiliser. Now I'm going to fill this with straight stitches. We just want them to fan out from the centre because we want our mushroom to look rounded when we've finished. So this isn't a stitch that I covered particularly in a stitch guide. It is just straight stitches, and we're going to put the first layer in just to get a sense of the shape of the gills, and then we're going to put the rest in later. So I'm starting at the centre so that I get my angles right, and I'm just working backwards and forwards, putting long stitches from where the mushroom stalk goes into the base of the mushroom to the outside edge of the gills, and I'm working my way round. Don't feel that you have to fill it at this point. We are going to fill it later. We'll come back with some different shades of brown and get a much more defined shape once we've dissolved our stabiliser. So if I bring it up close, hopefully you can just about see there it is pale thread on the white stabiliser, but that's like some radiating stitch lines coming out from the centre. So I'm just going to put the rest in on this mushroom. So that's all of those in place, and I'm just going to put in the rest. Now, another thing that will help me once that stabiliser is gone is if I have a sense of the shape of the mushroom stalk. So I'm just going to back stitch around them. This was a bit sort of belt and braces because I did end up doing my stitching before I dissolved the stabiliser, but I needn't have done. I could have just dissolved it beforehand. So there, I hope you can see, I've just outlined the mushroom stalks. It just gives a bit of a boundary for the stitching that I'm going to put in there. So that's our foundations. I'm going to stitch in the little mushrooms. I'll just do one on camera. I'm going to do this with satin stitch. I've got 3 strands of a sort of gold thread here. This is just an anchor stranded cotton. And I'm going to start by back stitching around the shape of the mushroom cap. So that's my outline. And now I'm going to satin stitch this, but I'm going to pad this a little bit. So I'm going to satin stitch it twice. I'm going to start by working horizontally, and I'm just going to fill in that space with satin stitch. You can find this stitch in our November stitch guide video, and I'll link that in a card at the top of the screen. The key is to get your threads lying flat and make sure your stitches are all in the same direction, at the same angle, and are as close together as possible so that you can't see anything in between them. It's really worth taking your time with this to get the best possible finish. You can see that I'm working really slowly, and I do sort of lay the thread across the mushroom cap before I decide where to take my needle back down. So I'm just filling in the rest of the mushroom cap there. And now I'm going to work back vertically, and this is going to cause the mushroom cap to be sort of raised from the surface, and it will sort of bulge out a little bit, and that's exactly what I'm trying to achieve. I want this to look a little bit more three-dimensional than flat. So I'm just putting in another layer of satin stitches going the other way now, and if you just rub your needle over it, it will even out your stitching, and some threads will polish up. So if you're using a linen thread, for example, it will polish up a little bit if you run your needle over it. So that's my mushroom cap, and if I turn it to the side, I'm hoping you'll be able to see it's doming out a little bit. I'm going to put the rest in, and then we can come on to the next stage. So that's all our mushroom caps, and I'm not going to do the stalks just yet. I'm going to wait a little bit because they are in the foreground, and it's going to make it really hard to stitch our mushroom stalks. I thought I would have a bit of a go at thread painting again. I've got 2 strands of a light beige here, and as I said in our stitch guide video, I am not a thread painting expert by any means, so this is just having a go. And I'm going to try and round out the shape of the mushroom stalk by angling the stitches so that they follow the curve. So these will sort of point in towards each other as we go up the mushroom stalk, and that will help give it a bit of a sense of 3 dimensions. So I'm just using long and short stitch here, trying to create a ragged edge at the top that I can blend the next shade into. But again, it's just straight stitches worked quite closely together. So I'm just going backwards and forwards, putting in this first layer of colour. I felt like it needed some highlights, so I came back in with a single strand of a cream thread that was a bit lighter still, and I just put some flecks of cream right at the bottom of the mushroom stalk. We want it to sort of get darker as it goes up to the mushroom cap because that is shadowed there. So I've put my first colour in. We're going slightly darker now. You can see I've got my mid-tone, and I'm adding my next layer of colour, but interlocking the stitches with this mid beige with the paler beige that I've just stitched. Now I've got a darker beige and I'm working up to the point where the mushroom frill is, and I'm thinking about where the natural shadows would be. So it would be dark underneath the mushroom cap and it would be dark underneath the frill around the mushroom stalk. And so I've graduated my colours up to that point. And again, now I've got all three colours in, I'm just rubbing my needle over the surface just to even out any lumps and help the colours blend together, hoping you can see the blend there. Now, I love using selvages for this purpose. I've stitched several mushrooms and I really love using this as the frill around the stalk of the mushroom. If I'm not getting my fungi terminology correct, please excuse me, I'm not an expert. So I've just cut a little sliver of the selvage there that's frayed and fluffy. It's just the edge of a piece of fabric, and I guess it's where they take it off the loom. And I'm just cutting it so that it's shaped like the stalk. It's a really tiny piece here. And I'm just going to use a single strand to put a few stitches in place. And this is going to add a little bit of dimension to our piece. We're going to have that frill that sits forward of the mushrooms. It's going to look more natural, I think, and it's just another texture into our stitching. So I just love using these bits of fabric that would end up going to waste. Once that's secure, I'm going to carry on thread painting up to the very top of the mushroom stalk. So I'm going to come back in with 2 strands of my pale beige and then graduate it up. And the key is that your stitches should follow the outline of your shape. So at the bottom of that stalk, my stitch is lined up with the curve at the bottom of the mushroom stalk, and right at the top where it meets the mushroom cap, I'm going to curve them round again so that I'm sort of describing the shape with my stitches. So that's our finished mushroom stalk with its little frill. I'm going to put the rest in and then we'll come back and look at the next stage. I should just mention that we've got this gold mushroom cap here that's sitting over the stalk of this mushroom on the right. And what's really handy with satin stitch is that it forms a really defined line, and particularly working on felt, it sort of quilts around the edge. And so it makes it really easy to see where your stitches should be when you're stitching things that sit behind it in the image. Because they're so raised up, I'm hoping you can see it a bit better there, it's going to make it easy to work around. So when I'm stitching the mushroom stalk, I'm only going to stitch up to the edge of that gold mushroom cap. And we haven't done our stalks yet because they are sitting right in front. It's going to make it really difficult to stitch in the stalks that are behind. So we'll put our gold mushroom stalks in right at the end. So I'm going to get on with that and then we'll come back. Right, so I've made quite a lot of progress here. I've put in all my mushroom stalks with their little frills. I've put frills on 3 of them, and I've also dissolved my stabiliser. And the only downside of that is that it's stuck together, my mushroom frills, because the starch hasn't quite washed out. It's sort of formed a glue that's bound them all together. I should have dissolved it before I thread painted those stalks, really, because I'd outlined them so the lines were there, but I didn't. So you might want to dissolve your stabiliser once you've got the outline of your mushrooms in. I wanted to put some stitching on the mushroom caps. I could leave them as they are, I think they look quite nice as they are, but I just want to add a little bit of something extra. So I'm just using quite a sketchy fill here. I want to start by helping out the Bondaweb, so I'm going to do a running stitch around the outside first of all, and that's just going to hold that mushroom cap in place. And then I want to do some sketchy filling, so we're not going to totally fill this mushroom cap because we've got our fabric there, but I want it to look stitched as well. So I've got a mid red here, and I'm just going to add some straight stitches. I want it to sort of fade around, so I'm going to have a lighter side and a darker side. So this mid red is just going to be scattered across the mushroom cap, and I'm just doing stitches of different lengths just to put in some, almost like some shading really, just some little lines that are going to redden up that mushroom cap and just add a little bit of stitch detail. So now I've got a lighter shade, and I'm going to work with this mostly on that left hand side. So I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm stitching over the top of my running stitch as well because I don't want the running stitch to stand out too much. I'm just adding a little bit of highlight to that left side of the mushroom, and it's really important that when I'm adding highlights they're on the same side of each of the mushrooms, so I'm always going to keep the lighter shades to the left. Now I've got a very dark red. I'm just using single strands here. I've got a dark red here, and I thought it would be helpful to do a little bit of needle weaving to describe that shape a little bit. I'm just going along the bottom edge of the mushroom cap to define it a little bit more strongly. But adding some horizontals will help your mushroom look rounder. It's almost like cross hatching with thread. So I'm just working backwards and forwards, adding just one or two horizontals just to round out that mushroom cap. If I bring it up close, I hope you can see some of the detail there. Now, it wouldn't be a mushroom prompt unless we had a red capped mushroom with white spots. It's the wrong shape to be a fly agaric, but we're going to do something reminiscent of that. The best way I know to do this is some French knots, and the other reason I like using French knots for this is that the spots on red and white mushrooms are not flat, they are raised, and so we're creating texture to the mushroom as well by doing this. Now, it's really important to remember that not all of the spots are the same size and shape, so I'm varying my French knots here. I'm doing some with 2 wraps, some with 1 wrap, then I come back in with a single strand and do some like that. So I've got some really mixed textured spots on my mushroom there. Once I'm happy with the stitching on my mushroom cap, I'm going to come back in and add some more to the gills, and I'm just going to fill in the gaps. I don't want any red showing through from the felt, and I'm just going to layer up colour now. So again, it's going to look quite sketchy. It's a really loose version of satin stitch. I'm going in with that beige again. And now I'm going to come back in with a mid-brown, sort of a goldish brown, I suppose. And I'm just going to follow along and do exactly the same. So I'm putting some more lines in that radiate around the gills of the mushroom, just to make it look more rounded. And then finally, I'm going to come in with a very dark brown, and I'm going to be really strategic with the placement of these stitches. You can notice that I'm not covering the whole distance between the mushroom stalk and the outside of the cap. I'm keeping these stitches centered around the mushroom stalk where it would be darkest, and I'm just going to keep adding them until I feel like there's enough shadow in there to make the mushroom look almost three-dimensional. So that's what we've got so far. So I'm going to do that for all the mushrooms, and then I'll come back and show you my progress. So here's my stitched mushroom caps. I've got all the gills in there and some detail on all of the caps of the mushrooms. Our next stage is to put in our gold mushroom stalks. So I've threaded up all 6 strands of the same gold thread that I used for the mushroom caps, and I'm just making a long straight stitch, keeping my needle threaded, and I'm going to couch these down. I want to make them curved, and the best way of doing that, you could just back stitch it, but I think the best way of doing that is going to be couching. So I've got a single strand of a slightly darker gold here, and I'm just laying down some horizontal stitches that catch that long gold stitch in place. We looked at couching in September, and I'll link the video of the couching tutorial at the top of the screen, so that if you're not familiar with this technique, you can go and check that out and find out what I'm doing. So couching means that I can add curves into the mushroom stalk and make it look really organic, like it's growing in an unusual and accidental way. And I'm just going to repeat the same process with all of those gold mushrooms, making sure they've all got stalks. So that's our mushroom stalks in, and the last thing I want to do is create a bit of ground for the mushrooms to sit on. So I've got a sort of mossy green here, and I'm just going to put in some blades of grass, and again I've got 2 strands, and I'm just putting some fairly random straight stitches. I want these to cross over each other, go in different directions. I don't want anything looking too regular. So we want this piece to look like we've just stumbled across it in a forest, and we've just found this little patch of mushrooms nestled in the grass. I don't want to destroy my thread painting, so I'm going to keep stitches over those mushroom stalks to a minimum, because I want to show off the fill stitches. So it's just a matter of putting in straight stitches until you feel like there's enough to give a suggestion of grass. And I'm coming back in now with some other shades to give that a bit of dimension, so I don't want all my grass to be one shade. Finally, we want to add a little bit of moss, and I'm going to do that with French knots, but I'm not going to keep them taut. I'm going to leave it really loose, so you can see I'm letting go of the thread there rather than holding it tight around the needle, and that creates loops rather than tight knots. And most of the time it's what you don't want to do with a French knot, because most of the time you want your French knot to be neat and precise. But for something like this, it creates a really lovely and interesting texture. So I'm just going to add loads of these in different shades of green, and it's going to give the illusion of moss at the bottom. So there's our finished piece. I've got my mushroom caps, I've got my mossy grass at the bottom. We've got thread painting, we've got that sketchy radiating fill there. We've got some sketchy fill on the mushroom caps, and we've got our satin stitch gold mushrooms. And I just can't tell you how much I enjoyed making this piece. I hope you've enjoyed it too. I'm really looking forward to seeing your creations. Do share them at #FSHwingingit, and so we can see them all together. You could also add #FSHwingingit45. If you've enjoyed this piece, I'll link something similar here, and I'll put a video up here that's best for you. If you'd like to subscribe, click on our logo down here, and it makes it really easy for you. Have a great week creating your mushroom pieces. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.